On March 12, 2018, a Bombardier Dash 8 Q400 crashed in Kathmandu, Nepal. Ground observers reported that the aircraft had performed strange maneuvers, flown in circles, and even almost hit the airport tower before finally crashing. What on earth happened here? Let's find out. Welcome to airspace. Shortly after midday on March 12, 2018, US-Bangla Flight 211 was preparing for its 1.5-hour flight from Dhaka, Bangladesh, to Kathmandu, Nepal. On board the turboprop aircraft were 67 passengers, 2 flight attendants, and the cockpit crew, consisting of a seasoned 52-year-old captain and a female first officer who had just recently joined the company at age 25. Both individuals had a good reputation and were described as being well-spoken and professional. But in the cockpit, strange scenes started to unfold before the aircraft had even left the ground. In a discussion with ground personnel over the radio, the otherwise patient and calm captain became very agitated and started insulting the ground crew severely. When the Dash 8 finally left the ground a few minutes later, the captain overheard a conversation on the company radio frequency that was not addressed to him, but he decided to take the message very personally and insulted all participants of this conversation too. The first officer quietly endured his ugly slurs that were not directed towards her, but must have seemed odd and intimidating. 15 minutes after departure, the captain started a heated monologue about a female first officer who had formerly worked for US-Bangla Airlines and whom he had personally trained. According to him, she had talked behind his back about him being a terrible instructor. But it didn't end there. Apparently, people were talking about him having an affair with her too. These allegations seemed to greatly agitate the otherwise calm captain, and he started rambling on about his love life and other very private topics. In the end, he even stated that all this had made him feel so bad that he had resigned from the company a few days prior to the flight. By now, you might be wondering why I am telling you all this, just as the poor first officer must have wondered the same. But bear with me, as all this will be important later. The flight continued towards Kathmandu, where a difficult approach would wait for the pilots. As you might remember from my video on Turkish Airlines Flight 726, Kathmandu is surrounded by high mountains, requiring an approach that is either curved through the valleys like this, or straight but steep. The crew of US-Bangla 211 opted for the straight but steep variant. Air traffic control advised the flight that they would have to expect 5 to 10 minutes of delay before they could start the approach, and so the crew programmed a holding pattern at the beginning of the approach in anticipation of that. Meanwhile, the captain's heated tirades continued, and at one point, he even started crying. He used language that would get my channel demonetized faster than you can hit the like button. Please do so, by the way. To calm down, the captain lit a cigarette, but subsequently dropped it and had to search for it as it rolled across the cockpit carpet. He also confessed that he hadn't slept at all the night before. Meanwhile, the aircraft came closer and closer to the pre-programmed holding pattern, and the first officer tried to steer the conversation away from the captain's personal problems by referring to the progress of the flight at hand. Shortly before reaching the beginning of the approach, where the crew had programmed the holding pattern, no correct approach briefing had been made by the captain. At this moment, Kathmandu Air Traffic Control unexpectedly cleared US-Bangla 211 to commence the approach without the need for a holding pattern. Gladly, the pilots accepted, but forgot to delete the holding pattern in the flight management system. When the aircraft reached the initial descent point a few moments later, the aircraft started turning to the left as programmed, instead of continuing straight ahead towards the runway as the pilots had expected. Immediately, the captain intervened and commanded the autopilot to turn the plane back towards the approach course in a shallow angle that would eventually intercept the track of the final approach. But here, he made a crucial mistake. While he corrected the heading, he forgot to rearm the navigation mode of the autopilot. In that configuration, the plane just continued on the heading and did not capture the final approach track when it crossed it a few miles later. The crew also failed to start a pronounced descent, instead opting for a very shallow one, ending up high. In the meantime, the captain asked for the landing checklist, which was performed by the first officer, but incorrectly. Both pilots had missed that they had forgotten to lower the landing gear. When they finally emerged below the cloud cover, the runway was nowhere to be seen. If the approach would have been completed correctly, it should have appeared straight ahead of the aircraft. Confused, the pilots started looking for the runway. About at the same time, the gear warning horn started blaring loudly through the cockpit, attempting to warn the crew that the landing gear still was not down. It was constantly ignored. Instead, the captain asked for the landing checklist once more, to which the first officer stated that it had been completed. In the meantime, the pilots continued searching for the runway in vain. They probably anxiously looked straight ahead through clouds and humidity, missing the fact that the runway was to their left while they were flying almost parallel to it. Eventually, they passed it and continued towards the mountains rising to the north. Finally, the crew recognized that the landing gear was not down and lowered it. Air traffic control noticed that the aircraft had missed the runway and informed the crew that their landing clearance had been for runway 02 and that they were going for runway 20, the opposite direction, and asked what the crew intended to do now. The captain said he would be landing on runway 02, underlining his confusion. What follows from here can only be described as utter chaos and disorientation. Several warnings started blaring in the cockpit, warning the crew about excessive sink rate and about the fact that the aircraft was heading straight for a mountain range. Finally, it dawned on the crew that they must have missed the runway. To correct that, the captain initiated a very steep turn back towards the airport while barely remaining airborne. At one point, the aircraft descended as low as 175 feet or 53 meters above the ground. Eventually, the aircraft climbed again, but now headed perpendicularly to the runway in a westerly direction, while another plane was landing on runway 02. Air traffic control frantically warned the crew of US-Bangla 211 not to land at this moment. The crew continued westwards for a short while, still in search of the runway. Then, they turned back towards the airport once more, ignoring all warnings by air traffic control. Finally, the first officer spotted the runway at their 3 o'clock position, that is, directly abeam to their right. Since the aircraft had climbed somewhat during the preceding turn, the aircraft now seemed high and a direct approach to the runway should have been impossible. But anyway, the captain opted to dive bomb towards what he thought was the runway. He now called for the landing checklist for the 6th time. Initially, he headed towards the taxiway and was warned by air traffic control about that dangerous mistake. The captain corrected the course somewhat, then the aircraft crossed the runway threshold while still in a turn at 450 feet, impossibly high for a safe landing. The Dash 8 then crossed the airport's domestic apron and headed straight for the control tower, where air traffic controllers ducked behind their consoles in fear. Finally, the captain executed another diving turn towards the runway, now again at an angle. In the end, the aircraft slammed into the runway surface with its right landing gear first. Initial impact marks of the landing gear were found halfway down the runway. Since the aircraft landed at a severe angle to it, momentum carried it off the paved surface quickly. The Dash 8 plowed through the grass and perimeter fence, descended a downslope, and eventually burst into flames. The captain, first officer, both flight attendants, and 47 of the 67 passengers died in the crash. In the investigation that followed, it was revealed that the captain had formerly served in the Bangladesh Air Force as a fighter pilot, but was discharged in 1993 due to a depression. He was re-evaluated in 2002 and was declared fit for flight. According to various sources, including his aviation medical examiner, he did not show any recurrence of symptoms after 2002 and appeared to be happily married. He and his wife also had a teenage son. Still, the board of investigators reached the conclusion that the captain must have suffered a mental breakdown while on this flight. His otherwise calm and collected demeanor was absent on Flight 211, with him cursing aggressively, crying, and even lighting up a cigarette in the cockpit. A very strange and out-of-place action for a man who was known in the company as a good and well-respected and well-qualified instructor. Investigators attempted to find the source for his outbreak and hypothesized that he might have been anxious about his future after tendering his resignation, even though apparently he had only given it verbally. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that he seemed very insecure about his future and was wondering what he should do now for a living. It is well possible that this severe stress contributed to his mental breakdown, impairing his ability to stick to procedures and to act prudentially. But the board also noted that while a toxicological test was performed after the crash, it did not include any tests to look for traces of medications that are used to treat depression, so there is the possibility that the captain was flying under the influence. Another question that remains is why the first officer did not intervene during the progress of the flight. There would have been so many chances to do that, considering the many things that were not orderly on this day. Most likely, she was either intimidated by her instructor, given the age and hierarchy gap between the two. If one considers his violent outbreaks and curses directed towards another woman, this belief can only be reinforced. Finally, her reluctance to intervene towards a senior might also have stemmed from the crew's cultural background. Or maybe she was simply overwhelmed. Mind you, she was a new first officer in training, and this had been her very first flight to Kathmandu, a challenging flight. Combine this with an instructor that is behaving erratically, and you have a recipe for disaster. If at any time the crew had reverted to normal procedures, recognizing that they had made not one but several mistakes, they could have simply advanced their throttles, gone around and performed a missed approach. But alas, the captain seemed hell-bent on completing this approach, even from an impossible position. The reasons as to why he unfortunately took to his grave. This story once again underlines the human factors involved in aviation. What do you think? Could this accident have been avoided at all? Leave a comment down below. If you liked my account of the story, leave a like and subscribe for more aviation content. See you in the next one.